Hey guys, tonight we are traveling way back, not to your grandparents' time, not even to the time of castles and knight, but to one of the very first places we'd call a civilization. We're going to the sun-scorched plains between two rivers, the land of Mesopotamia. It's a place of ziggurats, clay tablets, and some truly baffling rules. Honestly, if you were dropped there with your modern sensibilities, you probably wouldn't survive the first day, not because of war or famine, but because you might accidentally commit a crime so strange you couldn't have imagined it existed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Go ahead and drop your city and the time in the comments below. It's always a quiet thrill to see how far these stories travel while the world sleeps. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background tone, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you can feel a dry, warm breeze on your skin. The air is thick with the smell of dust, baked bread, livestock, and the faint, earthy scent of wet clay from the riverbank. You're standing on a bustling street in a city whose name echoes through eternity, Babylon. The buildings aren't made of stone, but of millions of sun-baked mud bricks, giving the whole city a muted, sandy-brown glow under the relentless sun. In the distance, a colossal stepped pyramid, the city's ziggurat, reaches for the sky, a man-made mountain for the gods. As you wander through the crowded marketplace, past merchants shouting prices for barley, dates, and wool, you notice something that draws everyone's attention. It's not a statue of a king or a god, not in the way you might expect. It's a tall, black pillar of stone, nearly 8 feet high, planted in a public square. It's made of diorite, a stone so hard and dark it seems to drink the sunlight. As you get closer, you see it's covered from top to bottom in tiny, wedge-shaped markings, a script you recognize as cuneiform. At the very top, there's a carving a king standing reverently before a seated god, who is handing him a ring and a staff, symbols of divine authority. This, you realize, is the famous Code of Hammurabi. It's one of the oldest and most complete legal codes ever discovered, a proclamation from the king that he is a shepherd of his people, tasked by the gods to make justice reign. You can trade the script, of course, but you know its purpose was to create order, to protect the weak from the strong, the widow from the powerful. It covers everything from business, contracts, and family law to professional standards. And this brings us to our first, seemingly silly ancient law. You glance over at a nearby alley, tied to a post, showing CUD with a look of profound indifference. Is it not? It's a beast of burden, the ancient equivalent of a family car and a tractor rolled into one. It looks harmless, maybe a little boring. A mischievous thought enters your head. What if you were to just annoy it, not hurt it, just give it a little poke or shout to see it jump? A harmless brain, right? Wrong. In Hammurabi's Babylon, that ox is not just an animal. It's a critical piece of economic infrastructure, and the law is intensely interested in it. The code has specific rules for what happens if an ox gores someone, who is liable if it trespasses, and what the rental fee is for hiring one. For instance, Law 251 states that if a man's ox is a known gore and its owner has been officially warned but fails to secure it properly, and that ox then kills a free-born man, the owner must pay a hefty fine of half the mina of silver. The law doesn't care about your intent to annoy. It cares about the chain of responsibility and the immense value of both the ox and the person it might harm. Messing with your neighbor's ox wasn't just being a nuisance. It was tampering with their livelihood, their ability to plow their fields and feed their family. In this context, the law isn't silly at all. It's a deadly serious reflection of what truly mattered in their world. But ancient justice had even stranger methods for when the evidence was unclear. Let's say you were accused of a crime that left no trace, like casting a dark magic spell. How does a judge rule on that? This is where you might face the river ordeal. This was a very real and very wet legal procedure. The accused would be thrown into the Euphrates River, which was considered a divine entity. The logic was simple. If terrifying, if the river god believed you were innocent, you would float, and you'd be pulled out, your name clear. If you were guilty, the river god would claim you, and you would sink. Historians still debate the practical application of this. Did they tie the person's hands? Did strong currents pre-minus determine the outcome? Regardless, it was a legal tool, a way for the divine to cast the final vote when human judgment failed. And this brings us to a point that academics are still arguing about today. Was this magnificent stone pillar, the Code of Hammurabi, a true day-to-day legal code that judges thumbed through to decide cases? Or was it something else? Some historians suggest it was more of a work of royal propaganda. It was Hammurabi's way of presenting himself as an ideal, wise ruler. It wasn't a statute book for lawyers, but a monument demonstrating his fitness to rule, showcasing his divinely inspired justice for all to see. The real, everyday law was likely a more complex mix of local customs and precedents that have long since turned back into dust. The pillar was the ideal. The reality was probably much messier. And it's in that gap between the perfect law on the stone and the chaotic life on the street that our journey truly begins. So you're standing there, contemplating this monument to justice, having just been warned away from bothering a farm animal. It seems like such a minor thing, but to truly understand why that ox is more protected than a VIP's limousine, you have to follow it out of the city. Let's leave the dusty grandeur of Babylon's walls behind and walk toward the green-gold patchwork of the fields that feed it. The air gets a little fresher here, heavy with the scent of damp earth and growing things, all thanks to a spitterbear of irrigation canals dug with immense effort, diverting the life-giving water of the Euphrates. Here, in the vast, flat expanse, you see the real engine of this civilization, and it has for legs, a tail, and a perpetually unimpressed expression. The ox, to call it a cow would be to miss the point entirely. A cow might give you milk, but an ox gives you everything else. It gives you civilization itself. Imagine you're a farmer with a small plot of land awarded to you by the temple of the king. Without an ox, your primary till is ashore. Black breaking lie inefficient wooden or bronze stepped hoe. You'd spend your days bent over, hacking up the dense sun-baked soil, trying to break it up enough to plant your barley seeds. A single person, working from sunrise to sunset, could barely cultivate enough land to feed their own family, let alone produce a surplus for the city. It's a life of subsistence, one bad harvest away from disaster. Now, bring in the ox. This creature is pure, flooding power. It's a biological engine of immense strength and stamina. Yoked to a simple wooden plow what archaeologists call an ard, it can do the work of 10 men. You stand behind it, guiding the ard as the ox leans into the yoke, its massive shoulders straining. The plowshare bites into the earth, not flipping the soil like a modern steel plow, but carving a deep furrow, aerating the soil and preparing it for seed. Suddenly, the amount of land you can cultivate explodes. You can plant more barley, more wheat, more sesame. You can create a surplus. That surplus is what feeds the priests, the soldiers, the scribes, and the king. It's what allows the potter to spend his day at his wheel instead of in the field. The ox is the bridge between mere survival and a complex society. And its work doesn't stop at plowing. Come harvest time, that same ox will be hitched to a wooden cart with solid wooden wheels, hauling sheaves of grain from the field to the threshing floor. On the threshing floor itself, a hard pan circle of flattened earth, the ox performs another vital task. It walks in endless circles over the harvested stalks, its heavy hooves expertly separating the valuable grain from the worthless chaff. It is, from planting to processing, the single most important non-human partner in the agricultural year. Losing your ox wasn't like your car breaking down. It was like your car, your tractor, and your entire factory burning down all at once. It was a catastrophe that could plunge a family into debt and ruin. This is why the law is so obsessed with it. But here's a little detail that really drives home its value. A piece of cold, Hard economics that often gets overlooked. In a land like Mesopotamia, where it was not plentiful, what did people use for fuel to bake their bread and heat their homes on a cool night? They used dried animal dung. The ox wasn't just providing labor, it was providing the fuel for the family's hearth. Its waste was a critical resource, mixed with straw and swept onto walls to dry in the sun, creating neat stacks of fuel bricks. It was also a key fertilizer, returned to the fields to enrich the soil that it had just plowed. When you protected an ox, you weren't just protecting a piece of machinery, you were protecting a family's plow, their transport, their food processor, their furnace, and their fertilizer factory, all in one slow-minus moving package. This naturally leads to a question that historians still actively debate. Given the immense cost and upkeep of an ox, it had to be fed, watered, and sheltered. Even when it wasn't working, could the average small-scale farmer actually afford to own one? The image of every farmer with his own loyal ox is probably a romantic simplification. Many academics now believe that a complex system of rental and shared ownership was far more common. Wealthier landowners, temples, or even entrepreneurs might have owned small herds of oxen and rented them out during the crucial plowing season. Hammurabi's code itself hints at this, with laws that don't just punish someone for stealing or harming an ox, but that set the official rental price for an ox, the plow, and even the hired plowman to go with it. So was the Mesopotamian countryside filled with independent farmers? Or was it more of a precarious gig economy built on renting the essential tools of survival from the wealthy? The evidence is fragmented, hidden in receipts on clay tablets, and the true picture of that economic reality is still being pieced together, argument by argument. The law's focus on the ox shows an incredible pragmatism. It was designed to protect the foundational pillar of the entire economy, and this same practical, almost ruthless logic, which measured everything by its tangible value, wasn't just applied to the beasts of the field. It extended into the noisy, bustling heart of the city, right into the places where people gathered to relax after a long day's work, the taverns. So you step away from the fields, leaving the scent of earth and the image of that indispensable ox behind, and you duck into the cool darkness of a city tavern. The light here is dim, filtering through a single doorway and maybe a small, high window, barely illuminating the haze of dust motes dancing in the air. The place is small, the walls are the same mud brick as everything else, and the furniture is just a few low benches and perhaps a rickety wooden table. The patrons are a mix of off-minus duty soldiers, local craftsmen, and farmers in town for the day. Thai woman, the ale-minus wife or tavern keeper, moves between them, ladling a thick, cloudy liquid from a large clay jar into smaller clay cups. This isn't beer as you know it. It's not fizzy, cold, or clear. Mesopotamian beer was more like a nutritious, slightly fermented liquid bread. It was a dietary staple, full of calories and B- vitamins, often consumed through a long straw to bypass the bits of grain and chaff floating on top. It was the drink of choice for everyone from the humblest laborer to the highest priest, and because it was so central to daily life, King Hammurabi had some very specific things to say about it. The ale-wife hands you a cup. As you take a sip of the sour, soupy brew, magical law 108 of the Great Code. This law dictated that if a tavern keeper refused to accept grain as payment for beer, and instead insisted on payment in silver at an inflated rate, or if she served a smaller measure of beer than what was paid for, she was to be found out and thrown into the water. Yes, the same river ordeal you heard about before. This wasn't just about getting a bad deal on a drink. It was about price gouging and consumer protection in one of the most fundamental industries. In a society where wages were often paid in daily rations of barley and beer, a dishonest tavern keeper wasn't just ripping you off. She was tampering with the entire economic system, cheating workers out of their rightful sustenance. But there's an even stranger rule connected to these drinking houses, one that shows the law was just about economics, but also about enforcing a rigid social and religious order. This is a true oddity. Law 110 stated that if a sister of a god or priestess A holy woman sworn to the temple either opened a tavern or even just entered one for a drink. She was to be burned to death. The punishment is shockingly severe. Why? A tavern was seen as a boisterous, worldly, and potentially disreputable place. It was a center for commerce, gossip, and sometimes conspiracy. For a consecrated woman, a vessel of the divine, to be seen in such a profane setting would have been a stain on the temple's honor and a violation of her sacred status. The law was policing the invisible but crucial boundaries between the sacred and the mundane. The punishment wasn't about the beer. It was about protecting the perceived integrity of the gods. Feeling perhaps that the tavern is more fraught with legal peril than you first thought, you finish your drink and step back out into the sun-bleached street. Across the way, you see a team of laborers working on a new house. They aren't laying stones, but slapping damp clay and straw into wooden molds to form bricks, leaving them to bake hard in the sun. The walls rise, course by course. It looks sturdy enough, but what if it isn't? This brings you to one of the most famous and most brutal sections of Hammurabi's code, the laws concerning builders. You look at the foreman overseeing the work and consider his liability. According to Law 229, if a builder builds a house for a man and does not make his work strong, and the house he has built collapses and causes the death of the owner, that builder shall be put to death. It's the principle of tolle on an eye for an eye applied with chilling precision. It gets even more specific. If the collapse kills the owner's son, then the builder's son shall be put to death. If it kills a slave, the builder must replace the slave. The law creates a terrifying symmetry of responsibility. It wasn't an accident. It was a failure of professional duty with the ultimate consequence. But here we arrive at another great debate that rages among historians and archaeologists. Did they really enforce these laws literally? Imagine the scene: a house collapses, killing a child. Would the city guard truly march to the builder's house, seize his innocent child, and execute them? It seems unimaginably cruel to a modern mind. Many scholars now argue that these pronouncements were a form of legal saber minus recti. They represented the absolute worst minus case penalty, establishing the value of the loss. The death of the owner's son meant the builder now owed a debt equivalent to the life of his own son. In practice, this terrible debt was likely settled in other ways, most commonly through a massive payment of silver. The threat of a son for a son was a powerful incentive for the builder to negotiate a generous settlement with the grieving family. So, was the law a literal command, or was it a terrifying starting point for a legal negotiation? The text of the code is silent on the matter, leaving us to wonder about the true nature of justice in the shadow of the ziggurat. From the ox in the field to the beer in the tavern to the bricks in the wall, you start to see the pattern. These aren't silly laws at all. They are the essential, pragmatic, and sometimes ruthless bolts holding a complex society together, ensuring that grain is harvested, beer is honest, and houses stand strong. And this obsession with order and property was about to find a new home along the fertile banks of another great river, the Nile. Your journey takes you south and west, leaving the land between the rivers behind. The landscape shifts dramatically. The world is no longer a uniform sandy brown. It's a land of stark, breathtaking contrasts. You are standing on the edge of the desert, the Desert, or Reed Land. It's a vast, silent, and utterly lifeless sea of rocklands, and that stretches to an infinite horizon. But at your feet begins the Kemet, the Black Land. It's a ribbon of intensely fertile, dark soil, impossibly green and vibrant, snaking its way through the desolation. This is the gift of the Nile. Unlike the temperamental Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile was predictable. Its annual flood was not a disaster to be feared, but a blessing to be welcomed, reliably depositing a fresh layer of black silt. This rhythm of flood and harvest, of life springing from the edge of death, shaped the entire Egyptian worldview. Their obsession wasn't with the pragmatic, day minus to minus day contracts that filled Hammurabi's code, but with something far grander: eternity. And the ultimate expression of that obsession was the tomb. You walk towards one of the great necropolises, a city of the dead built with more permanence than the cities of the living. The houses and palaces of Memphis or Thebes were made of the same mud brick as in Mesopotamia. designed to crumble back into the earth. But the tombs, the houses of eternity, were carved from solid rock or built with colossal blocks of limestone and granite. They were meant to last forever, because in the Egyptian mind, death wasn't an end. It was merely a transition, a dangerous journey your soul had to undertake to reach the paradise of the afterlife. For that journey to succeed, two things were essential. Your body had to be preserved through mummification so your soul could recognize it, and your tomb had to be stocked with everything you'd need for eternity. This included food, furniture, weapons, board games, and even small servant statues called as heptai who would magically come to life to do your work for you in the next world. Stealing a man's grain from his field was a crime, certainly, but robbing his tomb? That was something else entirely. It was just that. It was spiritual murder. You were erasing someone from existence, condemning them to wander as a lost, hungry spirit, unable to complete their journey. You were attacking their forever. This is why the laws against tomb robbing were so incredibly severe. The state considered it one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. If caught, you wouldn't just face a fine. The punishments were designed to be a terrifying deterrent. Surviving papiers court records from the New Kingdom detail the proceedings. Accused robbers were subjected to harsh interrogation, which often involved beating the soles of their feet with a rod, a procedure called the bastinado. If convicted, the sentences were brutal. You might have your nose and ears cut off, marking you as a criminal for life, shamed in this world and the next. The ultimate penalty was death, often by being impaled on a sharp stake, a slow and agonizing public execution designed to strike fear into the hearts of any would-minus be looters. Yet, here is the truly tsipa, or bizarre, part of the story. While the state was publicly executing small minus time crooks for breaking into tombs, there's compelling evidence that, at certain times, the state itself was the biggest tomb robber of all. During the late New Kingdom, as Egypt's power waned and its treasury dwindled, officials came up with a pious minor-sounding solution. They began a program of officially sanctioned tomb recycling. Priests and scribes, under the pharaoh's authority, would enter the ancient tombs of their long-minus dead ancestors. They would meticulously inventory the gold, jewelry, and other precious materials, strip them from the coffins and the mummies, and return them to the state treasury to be melted down and reused. Then, they would wrap the desecrated mummy and move it, along with dozens of others, to a secret, unmarked hiding place, a mummy cache for safekeeping. The famous discovery in 1881 of a hidden cache at Nile Monastery, containing the mummies of some of the greatest pharaohs in history, like Ramesses the Great, was the end result of this very process. So, was it a crime? Not if the state did it. It was reframed as a necessary, even respectful, act of protecting the royal ancestors while conveniently propping up a failing economy. This brings us to one of the most persistent popular myths, and a subject of continued scholarly discussion, the curse of the pharaohs. We've all heard the stories of archaeologists mysteriously dying after opening a tomb. Did the Egyptians actually place magical curses to protect their dead? The answer is yes and no. They certainly inscribed texts on tomb walls that were meant to threaten intruders. These texts, however, weren't quite the magical booby traps of Hollywood. They were more like legal and religious warnings, appealing to divine justice. A typical curse might read something like, "As for any man who shall enter this tomb in his impurity, I shall wring his neck as a bird's. The crocodile shall be against him in the water, the serpent shall be against him on the land." Here's where the academic debate lies. Were these threats purely symbolic? A spiritual no trespassing sign meant to appeal to the gods to punish the transgressor in the afterlife? Or did the ancient Egyptians believe these words held active power to inflict real harm in the here and now? Some Egyptologists argue that in a society steeped in magic these were seen as very real, potent spells that could cause sickness, misfortune, or death. Others contend they were more formulaic, a way of underscoring the legal and religious gravity of the crime without a belief in an automatic, magical retribution. The truth is likely somewhere in between, a complex belief where the line between a prayer for divine punishment and a direct magical attack was beautifully, and perhaps purposefully, blurred. This profound respect for the sacred, this legal and spiritual protection thrown around the dead, was a defining feature of Egyptian life. But this protective aura wasn't just limited to the gilded coffins of long-minus dead kings. In Egypt, divinity wasn't just in the sky or in the afterlife. It walked on for pillars, slithered on its belly, and flew on wings. And harming one of these living gods could land you in even more trouble than disturbing the dead. You're still in Egypt, a world where the sacred and the mundane are woven together, so tightly, you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. You see it in the reverence for the dead and the elaborate tombs they inhabit. The Nile, as you walk through the crowded, living streets of a city like Bubastis, the cult center for a particularly popular goddess, you notice something else. They are everywhere, lounging in sunbeams in dusty temple courtyards, slinking gracefully along the tops of mud-minus brick walls, winding themselves around the legs of merchants in the marketplace. Celts, they seem to own the place, moving with a silent, confident authority. In your world, a cat is a pet, a companion, maybe a minor nuisance if it digs up your garden. Here, in the land of the pharaohs, that same creature is a walking, purring vessel of the divine, and the law reflects this with a terrifying intensity. To understand why, you have to know about the goddess Bastet. She was originally depicted as a fierce lioness minus-headed deity, a protector of the pharaoh and a warrior goddess, but over time, her image softened. She became the cat minus-headed goddess of the home, of fertility, of joy, and of protection from evil spirits. She was a gentle, beloved deity, and the humble domestic cat was her earthly incarnation. This divine association is what led to one of history's most famous animal protection laws. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, visiting Egypt around 60 BCE, wrote about it with utter astonishment. He tells the story of a Roman citizen named member of the occupying power, mind you, who accidentally killed a cat, despite the fact that it was an accident, and despite pleas from local officials who were terrified of angering their Roman overlords. A mob of furious Egyptians seized the man and, ignoring all official orders, killed him. Such was the depth of their outrage. Deliberately killing a cat was an unquestionable death sentence. It wasn't just killing an animal. It was an act of profound blasphemy, an insult to Bastet herself, and a crime the state took with the utmost seriousness. Now, there's a simple, practical explanation for this. Egypt was a granary. Its wealth was its grain. Rats and mice were a constant threat to that wealth. Cats were the perfect, efficient, self-replicating pest control. Protecting cats was just good economic policy, much like protecting the ox in Mesopotamia. But the Egyptians took it to a whole other level. The protection wasn't just practical. It was deeply spiritual. When a family cat died of natural causes, the household would go into mourning. As a sign of their grief, the family members would shave off their eyebrows. The cat would then be carefully mummified, wrapped in fine linen, sometimes given a small wooden or ceramic mask, and buried in a sacred cat cemetery. And here's where the story takes a turn into the truly weird, revealing a scale of devotion that borders on the industrial. Archaeologists have uncovered vast necropolises for animals, cities of the dead dedicated not to humans, but to cats, ibises, crocodiles, and baboons. The most famous of these is at Saqqara, where a sprawling catacomb dedicated to Bastet was found to contain the mummified remains of, quite literally, millions of cats. In the 19th century, when these catacombs were rediscovered, the sheer quantity of cat mummies was so overwhelming that they were seen not as priceless artifacts, but as a commodity. Hundreds of thousands of them, the sacred offerings of a forgotten faith, were shipped to Liverpool, England, where they were unceremoniously ground into powder and sold as agricultural fertilizer. It's a surreal and ignominious fate for a creature once protected by the death penalty. The existence of millions upon millions of these mummified cats has led to a major debate among Egyptologists, one that questions the very nature of this animal worship. What was really going on here? One school of thought holds that these were all beloved pets or sacred animals from temple grounds that died naturally over many centuries, and their mummification was a final act of piety by their devout owners or keepers. However, modern technology has revealed a potentially darker and more commercial side to the story. CT scans performed on thousands of these animal mummies have shown that a huge number of them were very young cats, often less than a year old. Many of them show evidence of having their necks deliberately broken. This suggests a far less sentimental reality that priests were running massive catteries, breeding cats not as pets, but as a cash crop. A pilgrim visiting the temple of Bastet would want to make an offering to the goddess. The most appropriate offering, of course, was one of her sacred animals, so the temple priests would happily sell them a pre-minus mummified cat. The pilgrim would make their offering, feeling they had gained the favor of the goddess, while the priests made a tidy profit. Some excavated mummies have even turned out to be fakes, cleverly wrapped bundles of reeds, feathers, and random animal bones, sold to unsuspecting worshippers. So was this a civilization minus wide expression of pure religious devotion? Or was it, at least in part, a massive, cynical, and highly profitable religious racket? The truth is likely a messy combination of both. The law protected the idea of the cat as a sacred being, and the people's fury against the Roman who killed one was very real. But the machinery of religion and commerce created a system where the very animal being protected was also being mass-minus produced for sacrifice. It shows a fascinating complexity in how law, faith, and economics can interact, and if the Egyptians were this meticulous in their rules for the gods and their animals, it stands to reason they had equally specific ideas about how the people living under their protection should manage their own affairs, especially when it came to the fundamental building block of society, the family. Let's step away from the temples, the catacombs, and the divine animals. You leave the scent of incense and sacred dust behind and a much more familiar space, a private home. It's a simple dwelling, much like the others, with whitewashed mud-minus brick walls and a flat roof, where the family sleeps on hot nights. Inside, a husband and wife are having a disagreement. It's a scene as old as time itself. But what happens next isn't dictated by divine mystery or priestly ritual. It's governed by something remarkably down minus to minus earth, a legal contract. After the almost mystical logic of the laws protecting cats in tombs, you might expect Egyptian family law to be equally esoteric. You'd be completely wrong. When it came to marriage, divorce, and property, the ancient Egyptians were stunningly pragmatic, creating a system that, in some ways, was more progressive than laws seen in Europe thousands of years later. For starters, marriage wasn't really a religious ceremony. There was no priest, no temple blessing required. It was a social agreement, formalized by the couple starting to live together. The crucial part, at least for those with any property to their name, was the marriage contract. These surviving documents, written on sheets of papers, read less like a romantic declaration and more like a modern prenuptial agreement. It was all business. The contract would meticulously list all the property the bride was bringing into the marriage. This was her dowry, but with a very important distinction: it never stopped being hers. She retained full ownership of the land, the goods, the silver, or the donkeys that she brought with her. Her husband could manage it, but he couldn't sell it without her permission. This legal recognition of a woman's right to own and control her own property was revolutionary for the ancient world. An Egyptian woman could inherit land from her parents. She could buy and sell property. She could be a witness in court, and she could initiate legal proceedings on her own behalf, while her primary role was still centered on the home and family. The law saw her as a distinct economic entity, not as her husband's property, and this brought a fascinating level of security to the wife when it came to the end of a marriage. Divorce was straightforward and relatively common. If a couple decided they could no longer live together, they could simply declare their union over. But this is where the contract kicked back in with a vengeance, especially for the husband. If the wife initiated the divorce, she was entitled to take back all the property she had originally brought to the marriage. It was a clean break. But here's the wonderfully bizarre and clever part of the system: the divorce penalty for men. If the husband initiated the divorce without good cause, like adultery on her part, he not only had to give back everything she came with, but he also had to pay her a significant fine. On top of that, the contract often stipulated that he owed her a kind of alimony, a third of all the property they had acquired together during their marriage. And it gets even better. Many contracts included a clause that required the divorcing husband to provide his ex-wife with a fixed annuity, a yearly amount of grain, oil, and clothing for the rest of her life or until she remarried. This system made divorcing your wife a very, very expensive proposition. It acted as a powerful financial disincentive for a man to simply cast aside his wife for a younger one, a common practice in many other ancient societies. The law was, in its own way, protecting the family unit by making its dissolution a costly financial failure for the man. This, of course, has led to a major question among historians that is still under discussion. How widespread was this practice? Really, the beautifully detailed papyrus contracts we have all, by their very nature, from the small, literate slice of the population describes, the officials, the well minus to minus due artisans, did the illiterate peasant farmer and his wife, living in a mud hut by the Nile, have a similar arrangement? One side of the argument says no. These formal, written contracts were an elite luxury. The common folk likely operated on verbal agreements and local customs that were probably far less favorable to the woman. Their lives were governed by the hard realities of subsistence farming, not the careful clauses of a legal document. The other side argues that even if the written contract was rare, the principles it contained likely reflected the broader legal culture of Egypt. The idea that a woman had rights, that she wasn't just disposable, and that a man had a duty to provide for his divorced wife was probably a deeply ingrained social expectation, even if it wasn't written down. The law on papers may have been the gold standard that informed the customs of the entire society, creating a common understanding of what was considered a fair separation. The lack of records from the lower classes makes it a tantalizing but difficult question to definitively answer. This world of carefully balanced ledgers and legally protected wives seems surprisingly stable, almost modern in its sensibilities. But this Egyptian model of pragmatic social order was not the only one developing in the ancient Mediterranean. Across the sea, on a rocky peninsula of warring city-minus states, a new civilization was taking shape, and in one of its most prominent cities, Athens, a lawgiver was about to emerge whose name would become a permanent synonym for cruel, unforgiving, and severe justice. His laws would make a man long for the simple clarity of a cheating ill-minus wife being tossed in the river. You feel a new kind of air on your skin, cooler and tinged with the salty tang of the Aegean Sea. The landscape is no longer flat and predictable. You've traded the fertile ribbon of the Nile for the rocky, sun-minus drenched hills of Attica. You are in Athens, a city that, at this point in its history, is a chaotic, noisy, and quarrelsome teenager of a civilization. There's a restless energy here, a constant hum of argument and debate that you can feel in the central marketplace. The Agora, unlike in Egypt, where order seemed to flow down from the gods through the pharaoh. Here it feels like order is something that has to be clawed from the jaws of chaos every single day. Before this moment, justice in Athens was a messy and terrifyingly personal affair. If a man from one family murdered a man from another, there was no police force to call, no state prosecutor to try the case. The victim's family was expected, and socially obligated, to seek revenge themselves. This would trigger a counter-minus revenge from the other family, locking them into a vendetta, a devastating, multi-minus generational cycle of violence that could tear the fabric of the community apart. Justice was a blood feud. On top of this, the laws that did exist were unwritten. They were a web of customs and traditions known only to the aristocratic clans who held power. They could interpret, invent, and apply these laws to their own benefit, leaving the common farmer or craftsman with no recourse and no certainty. It is into this volatile mess that a man named Draco steps, around 621 BCE. He is tasked by the Athenian elite to do something revolutionary to write the laws down. For the first time, The law would be taken out of the private knowledge of the aristocrats and put into the public square, inscribed on wooden tablets for all to see. It was meant to be a step towards equality, a guarantee that there was one law for everyone. And in a way, there was. The law was simple, clear, and applied to everyone equally, and for almost every offense, the punishment was death. This is what made Draco's name infamous for all time. His legal code had all the subtlety of a guillotine. Did you steal a cabbage from your neighbor's garden? Death. Were you convicted of being lazy or idle? Death. Did you commit homicide? Death. The story, as told by later Greeks like Plutarch, was that when Draco was asked why he had fixed the same punishment for most offenses, he replied that small offenses deserved death, and he knew of no greater punishment for great ones. You can almost hear the collective gulp of the Athenian populace. Suddenly, the certainty of written law didn't seem so appealing. While it did take the power of arbitrary judgment away from the nobles, it replaced it with an unblinking, unfeeling, and merciless system. It was a brutal form of equality where the life of a cabbage thief was valued the same as the life of a murderer. But hidden within this famously harsh code was an even stranger law, one that reveals the unique political pressures of ancient Athens. This law dealt with a situation the Greeks called stasis, a period of intense civil strife, factional conflict, and political gridlock that threatened to paralyze the state. Draco's law on the subject was astounding. It made it illegal to be neutral. If the city was divided into warring factions, you, as a citizen, were legally obligated to pick a side and take up arms. If you chose to stand aside, to remain neutral, to say this is my fight, you would be stripped of your citizenship and your rights. Think about that. The law was forcing you into a conflict. It's a rather extreme way to encourage civic engagement. The logic behind it, however, speaks volumes about the Greek ideal of the citizen. The polis, or city-state, wasn't just a place you lived. It was a collective project that you were a part of. To be a citizen was to have a stake in its health and its future. In a moment of crisis, standing aside was seen as a dereliction of duty, a selfish act that prioritized your personal safety over the well-being of the community. A neutral citizen was a useless citizen, and therefore, no citizen at all. This leads us to the big question historians are still trying to unravel. What was Draco's real goal? Was he truly the bloodthirsty monster of legend? An arch-conservative aristocrat trying to terrorize the lower classes into submission with a fearsome legal code? This is the traditional view that his laws were tools of class oppression, designed to protect the property of the rich with the ultimate penalty. But there is another, more nuanced interpretation. Some historians argue that Draco, in his own severe way, was a brilliant state-builder, by making almost every crime punishable by death. He wasn't just being cruel, he was asserting the absolute and supreme power of the state. Before him, justice was a private matter between feuding families. Draco's code effectively outlawed the blood feud. It proclaimed that vengeance was no longer a private right. It was a state monopoly. If someone wronged you, you didn't go after them yourself. You went to the state, which would now prosecute the case and carry out the sentence. The sheer harshness of the punishments was a way of shouting that the state's authority was final and not to be challenged. In this view, he wasn't trying to oppress the people, but to break the power of the feuding clans and forge a true, unified state out of the chaos. It was a violent, painful birth, but it was the birth of public law. Ultimately, Draco's code was too rigid, too brutal to last. It addressed the problem of legal uncertainty, but created a new problem of excessive cruelty. It was like using a sledgehammer to fix a wash. The Athenian social fabric, stretched taut by this merciless system, was ready to snap. The city needed a new solution, a new kind of lawgiver. But the idea of using the law in strange and inventive ways to shape society had taken root, and it would soon lead to one of the most peculiar and ingenious political inventions in history, a system where you could get rid of a politician, not because they did something illegal, but simply because they were becoming too popular. The shadow of Draco's bloody laws eventually recedes. A new lawgiver, Solon, comes along and repeals most of them. creating a more balanced and humane system. But his reforms, while necessary, create a new kind of problem. With the old, rigid aristocracy weakened and more citizens involved in government, Athens becomes a hotbed of political competition. Ambitious, charismatic, and powerful leaders emerge, each commanding fierce loyalty, each promising a brighter future for the city. They clash in the assembly, they rally factions, and they create the very stoses, or civil strife, that Draco had tried to outlaw. Athens had survived the threat of arbitrary justice only to face the threat of being torn apart by its own brilliant politicians. They needed a tool, not to punish criminals, but to manage ambition. And so, you find yourself in the Athenian Agora, the sprawling, open heart of the city. It's a chaotic place, part government center, part shopping mall, and part social club. But today, there's a special kind of tension in the air. The assembly has decided that the political temperature is running too hot, that the rivalry between two great men has become dangerous. It is time to hold an ostracism. This is the peculiar political invention you heard whispers of. It's a process that feels utterly alien. It's not a trial. No one is accused of a crime. There are no lawyers, no witnesses, no evidence presented. It is a purely political vote, a kind of city-wide poll to answer a single question. Is there anyone among us whose power and influence has grown so great that he has become a threat to the health of our democracy? You watch as citizens line up, funneling through a roped off area. As each man steps forward, he hands an official a small, unassuming object, a shard of broken pottery. This is an OS dragon, the ancient equivalent of a ballot slip. Pottery was everywhere in the ancient world. Broken pieces were the most common form of garbage. On this piece of trash, each citizen has scratched a name. The officials collect these thousands of clay shards in urns. If more than 0 votes are cast in total, they will be counted. The man whose name appears most often must, within 10 days, pack his bags and leave Athens for 10 years. This is the truly bizarre genius of the law. The exiled man wasn't a criminal. He kept his citizenship and, crucially, all of his property. His family could remain in Athens and manage his estates. After a decade, he was free to return and even enter politics. Ostracism was a political tiger. It was a way for the city to have a no-fault divorce from one of its leaders. The Athenians had figured out that the best way to stop the powerful men from plunging the city into civil war was simply to ask one of them to leave for a while. It cooled tempers, diffused the crisis, and allowed the city to move on without bloodshed. It was a pre-emptive strike against the possibility of a tyranny born from overwhelming popularity. But here's a wonderfully mundane and humanizing detail that sheds light on how this grand democratic process actually worked on the ground. Archaeologists digging in Athens have uncovered thousands of these ostraka. And in one spot, near the Acropolis, they found a pit containing a cluster of 190 shards, all bearing the same name, Themistocles, a famous Athenian general and politician. What was strange was that analysis of the handwriting showed they had all been written by only about 14 different people. This was a bombshell. It suggests that political factions didn't just leave it up to individual voters. They likely produced these inscribed pottery shards and handed them out to their illiterate or undecided supporters as they entered the Agora. It was an organized, get the vote campaign. You can almost picture a political operative on a street corner, whispering, "Here, just hand this in. It's for the good of the city." It pulls back the curtain on the idealized image of democracy and shows a far more familiar world of political maneuvering. This discovery fuels one of the central academic debates about ostracism. What was it really for? The classical view, supported by ancient philosophers like Aristotle, is the noble one. Ostracism was a constitutional safeguard, a sophisticated mechanism to protect the democratic order from any single individual who grew too powerful, regardless of their political party. It was a shield, held up to defend the city itself. However, a more cynical and increasingly popular view among modern historians is that it was simply a political weapon. In this interpretation, Ostracism was a sword, used by the majority faction to conveniently get rid of the leader of the minority faction for 10 years. It was a constitutional way to rig the game. By excelling your chief rival, you gained a decade of relatively unimpeded power to pass your own laws and pursue your own agenda. The evidence of the pre-minus, written no stroker, certainly lends weight to this more hard-minus-nosed political view. Was it a high-minus-minded defense of liberty or a ruthless tool for partisan advantage? The answer is probably that it was both, depending on the specific circumstances and who was using it. This Athenian experiment in managing power through pottery and popular votes was unique. It showed a society deeply engaged with its own governance, constantly tinkering with the law to solve its problems. But Athens was not the only power in Greece. Far to the south, on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, its great rival was forging a completely different kind of society, built on a completely different set of laws. They weren't interested in debate, art, or charismatic leaders. They were interested in discipline, obedience, and strength, and their laws, designed to create the perfect soldier, were some of the most intrusive and restrictive in human history. Your next stop is Sparta. The vibrant, talkative energy of Athens fades away. You travel south, and the very atmosphere seems to change. It becomes quieter, more severe. You've arrived in the valley of the Eurotas River, a fertile plain surrounded by jagged, imposing mountains. This is Laconia, the home of the Spartans. There is no grand marketplace here filled with poets and philosophers arguing. There are no magnificent temples covered in marble sculptures. The city of Sparta itself is famously unimpressive, little more than a collection of villages. The Spartans didn't invest in walls or monuments. They invested in people, or rather, in crafting a very specific type of person, the perfect warrior, and their entire legal and social system was a relentless, lifelong machine designed for that single purpose. From the moment you are born in Sparta, the law has its eyes on you. According to the historian Plutarch, newborn infants weren't just welcomed by their parents. They were taken before a council of elders who would inspect them. If the baby was deemed healthy and strong, it was returned to its family to be raised. If it was found to be weak, sickly, or deformed, it was taken to a nearby chasm known as the APO, the place of rejection, and left to die. This wasn't seen as cruelty. It was state-mandated quality control. The Spartan state could not afford to waste resources on anyone who would not grow up to be a formidable soldier or the mother of a formidable soldier. If you survived this first test, your life was not your own. At the age of 7, boys were removed from their families and entered into the Agoge, a brutal, state-run military academy that would be their home for the next 2 decades. There, everything was about stripping away individual identity and forging unwavering loyalty to the group. They were kept perpetually underfed, encouraged to steal food to learn cunning and stealth, but if they were caught, they were flogged mercilessly, not for stealing, but for being clumsy enough to get caught. They slept on hard beds of reeds they had to gather themselves, wore a single garment year minus round, and were subjected to constant physical training on ritualized violence designed to toughen them. This total focus on military readiness led to a set of laws that look utterly bizarre from the outside. The Spartan lawgiver, a semi-mine, a mythical figure named Lycurgus, was said to have banned all useless art. You wouldn't find sculptors, poets, or philosophers here. Such pursuits were seen as frivolous distractions from the serious business of war. Even the money was designed to be awful. Lycurgus allegedly banned the use of gold and silver coins, the common currency throughout the rest of Greece. Instead, he instituted a form of currency made of iron. But it wasn't a simple coin. It was a massive, heavy, and unwieldy iron rod or disc, which had been heated and then quenched in vinegar to make it brittle and worthless as scrap metal. Imagine trying to go shopping with that. You couldn't slip a few coins in your purse. You'd need an ox cart to carry enough money to buy anything significant. This is a wonderfully weird piece of social engineering. The goal was to make wealth itself inconvenient. It made hoarding riches impossible, bribery difficult, and shopping for foreign luxury goods a logistical nightmare. It was a law designed to enforce simplicity and eliminate the envy and corruption that wealth was believed to bring. But perhaps the most intrusive law of all governed something as basic as eating dinner. Even after a Spartan man graduated from the agoge, got married, and technically had his own household, he was not allowed to eat his evening meal at home with his wife and children. He was legally required to eat every night with his army comrades in a public mess hall, called a sittiun. These communal meals were not banquets. The food was famously plain and unappetizing, the most notorious dish being a black broth made of pork, salt, vinegar, and blood. Membership in a mess hall was mandatory for citizenship. If you couldn't contribute your share of barley, wine, and cheese from your land, or if you were blackballed by the other members, you could lose your full citizenship rights. This law was a powerful tool of social control. It fostered camaraderie and bonding among the soldiers, ensured every man ate the same simple fare, and, most importantly, it kept the men in the constant company of their comrades, their minds always focused on the state and the army, rather than the private comforts of home and family. This brings us to a major historical debate that challenges the very image of Sparta we've just built. The picture we have of this austere, militaristic society comes almost entirely from outside observers Athenians, like Plato and Xenophon, or later Romans like Plutarch. They looked at Sparta and saw a fascinating, if terrifying, alternative to their own societies, and they often romanticized it as a perfect model of discipline and order. This is what historians call the Spartan mirage. The question is, was Sparta really like that? Some modern scholars argue that this traditional image is an exaggeration, a caricature created by outsiders who didn't fully understand the nuances of Spartan society. They suggest that perhaps the reality was less rigid. Maybe the law against eating at home was not always strictly enforced. Maybe some Spartans did find ways to accumulate secret wealth. Maybe the stories of infant exposure were embellished to make the Spartans seem more hardcore than they truly were. They argue that we are seeing Sparta through the biased lens of its rivals and admirers. Others maintain that while there might be some exaggeration, the core principles of the Spartan system, the agoge, the communal masses, the rejection of luxury were very real and are well supported by the available archaeological and textual evidence. Trying to separate the mirage from the reality is one of the great ongoing projects of ancient history. The intense, inward-looking world of Sparta, with its laws designed to free society in a state of permanent military readiness, was an outlier in the ancient world. Just as Athens began to decline, a new power was rising on the Italian peninsula. It was a city of farmers and soldiers, much like early Sparta, but with a global ambition that would dwarf everyone else. They were the Romans, and their first foray into the world of written law would be as practical, as grounded, and as obsessed with property as a farmer arguing with his neighbor over a fence. The intense, inward-looking world of Sparta, with its iron money and mandatory mess halls, melts away. You journey west, crossing the Adriatic and landing on the Italian peninsula. There he feels different yet again. It's the air of a place that is gritty, grounded, and deeply practical. You've come to a city built on 7 hills overlooking the Tiber River. This is not the majestic Rome of emperors and marble monuments that you see in movies. This is early Rome, a scrappy and unpretentious republic, a city of farmers, soldiers, and merchants whose primary concerns are land, livestock, and neighbors. Much like in early Athens, you find a society simmering with conflict. But this isn't a feud between aristocratic families. It's a class struggle. On one side are the patricians, the wealthy, land miners owning elite who have always held power. On the other are the plebeians, the common folk, the farmers, the artisans, the soldiers. For generations, the law in Rome has been an unwritten secret, a collection of customs and interpretations known only to the patrician magistrates. For a plebeian, going to court was a gamble. You didn't know the rules, and the judge, a patrician, could seemingly make them up to favor his own kind. The plebeians got fed up. They organized, they protested, they even threatened to secede from their own city. The struggle of the orders was a long, slow-burning crisis that threatened to tear Rome apart. And the plebeians had one central demand: write the law down, make it public, put it where we can all see it, so we know our rights. And so, around 450 BCE, the Romans did just that. They sent a delegation to Greece to study their laws, perhaps even the laws of Solon. And then they produced the city's first written legal code, the 12 Tables. These weren't etched on a grand stone pillar like Hammurabi's code. They were carved into 12 bronze tablets and displayed in the Roman Forum, the bustling center of public life. For the first time, the law was out in the open. Now, you'd expect the first great legal document of the future Roman Empire to be full of grand pronouncements about justice and liberty, and it had some of that. But mostly, it was about incredibly mundane, practical problems. This brings us to the perfect example of Roman legal thinking. Let's say you're a Roman farmer. You have a small plot of land where you grow wheat and olives. Your neighbor, Gaius, has a magnificent fig tree planted near your shared property line. It's a great tree, but its branches are now growing over your fence, casting a shadow on your precious sun-loving crops. Worse, they're dropping leaves and sticky, half-eaten figs all over your yard. In a pre-legal world, this could easily escalate. Harsh words, a fist fight. Maybe you'd sneak out at night and poison the tree. It's the kind of petty dispute that has fueled feuds for millennia. But now, you have the 12 tables. The law is beautifully specific. Table VII states that a man may gather the fruit that falls from his neighbor's tree onto his own land. 3 figs for you. More importantly, it also gives you the right to prune the branches of your neighbor's tree up to a height of 15 feet if they overhang your property. You don't need to argue with Gaius. You don't need to fight him. You have a clear, legal right. The law has replaced a potential conflict with a simple, peaceful procedure. This is the essence of early Roman law. It is less about soaring philosophy and more about practical problem-solving for a community of farmers. However, this same unsentimental pragmatism had a much darker side, revealed in another, far more chilling law from the tablets. Table IV addresses family matters and contains a stark command: a notoriously deformed child shall be killed quickly. There is no ceremony, no leaving the baby in a chasm like in Sparta, just a swift, legally sanctioned command. It's a brutal reflection of this society's values. A child was an economic unit. It needed to be strong enough to one day work the farm or fight in the legion. A severely disabled child, in their harsh calculus, was a drain on the family's resources with no future benefit to the state. The law wasn't being deliberately cruel. It was being brutally practical, applying the same cold logic to human life as it did to a diseased crop or a lame ox. The very nature of the 12 tables themselves is a subject of intense historical debate. For centuries, the traditional view was that this was a comprehensive law code, the source and foundation of all later Roman jurisprudence. It was seen as a complete system, a rulebook that judges could consult for any situation. However, many modern historians now argue this is a misunderstanding. They suggest the 12 tables were not a code in the modern sense at all. Instead, they were more of a charter of rights for the plebeians. They were meant to cover everything. They were a collection of laws specifically designed to address the biggest grievances the commoners had against the patrician elite. They focused on things like debt, legal procedure, and, yes, property disputes. The goal wasn't to create a perfect, all-encompassing legal system, but to carve out a set of basic, non-negotiable rights for the common citizen and put them on public display. So was it the first great law code of Rome? Or was it a hard -1 political document born from a specific class struggle? Academics still argue over its true purpose and scope. These laws, from the mundane to the merciless, govern the relationships between Roman citizens. They told you how to deal with your neighbor's tree and what to do in the face of a family tragedy. But they also hinted at a deeper, more powerful legal structure, one that governed the relationships inside a Roman household. If the state gave you the right to trim a branch, the power it gave the head of a Roman family over his own kin was something else entirely. It was an authority so absolute, it is almost terrifying to contemplate. You're still standing in that imagined early Roman landscape, a world governed by the relentlessly practical laws of the 12 tables. Haman knows exactly what to do about his neighbor's overhanging tree. He knows the penalty for defaulting on a debt, and he knows the grim procedure for dealing with a deformed infant. These laws govern his relationship with the community, the res publica, or public thing. But now, you follow that same man home. He walks through the door of his domus, his house, and as he crosses that threshold, he steps out of the world of public law and into a different legal universe entirely. Inside these walls, he is not just a citizen, he is a king. This is where you encounter one of the most powerful and far-minus reaching legal concepts the Romans ever devised patria potestas, the power of the father. This was just the normal authority a parent has over a child. It was a legal doctrine of absolute ownership. The head of a Roman family, the paterfamilias, was the only person in his household who legally existed. Everyone else, living under his roof, his wife in certain types of marriage, his daughters, his slaves, and, most shockingly, his sons and even his sons' families were under his hand, or manus. They were his legal property, no different from his land, his livestock, or his house. Let's really break down what this means. Imagine a Roman son. He's 40 years old. He is a respected magistrate who sits in the Senate. He is a brilliant general who has just returned to Rome in a triumph, parading his victorious legions through the streets to the roar of the crowd. He is, by any external measure, a powerful and successful man. But if his father, his paterfamilias, is still alive, that 40-year-old general legally owns nothing. Not the armor on his back, not the horse he rides, not the coins in his purse. Any salary he earns, any property he acquires, any spoils of war he wins, legally belong to his father. He cannot enter into a contract on his own behalf. He cannot have his own will. He is, in the unblinking eyes of Roman law, a legal child, an extension of his father's will. This power of the father was absolute, and its most extreme expression was the right neck is potest as the power of life and death. The 12 tables granted the paterfamilias the legal right to sell his children into slavery, to abandon them, or even to kill them for any reason he saw fit, without any state interference. The state's law stopped at his front door. Now for the truly strange part of this system, which shows just how deeply this idea of ownership was embedded. How could a son ever escape this total control? What if he wanted to get married and have his own legal identity? He couldn't just move out. He had to be legally released through a complex and theatrical ceremony called demonci patio. Because the son was property, he had to be sold. The law from the 12 tables stated that if a father sold his son 3 times, the son would then be free from his father's power. So to free his son, a father would have to stage a sham sale. He would bring his son and a trusted friend to a public official. He would sell his son to the friend, who would immediately free him. But according to the law, he was still under his father's power. They would have to repeat the sale a second time. The friend would buy him and free him again. Still not enough. Only after the 3rd sale was the legal tie finally, irrevocably broken. It was a piece of bizarre legal theater required to circumvent all of ownership that was as solid as a brick wall. This, inevitably, leads to the most hotly debated question about patria potestas. Did Roman fathers actually do it? Did they really execute their adult sons? It's a chilling thought. The historical record is thin and sensational. There are a few famous, semi-minus legendary stories. The first consul of the Republic, Lucius Junius Brutus, supposedly ordered the execution of his own 2 sons for treason. A commander named Manly Istorquits allegedly executed his son for disobeying a direct military order, even though the son's actions had led to a great victory. This is where the academic argument lies. One school of thought says that we should take these accounts, and the law itself, more or less, at face value. The power was real, it was absolute, and while it was probably used rarely, it was used. It was the ultimate bedrock of Roman social order, a fearsome power that ensured the discipline and obedience upon which the entire state was built. However, the more dominant view among modern historians is that this is a classic case of the law in the books being very different from the law in practice. They argue that while the legal right to kill one's son existed, the moss may err on the unwritten but incredibly powerful customs and traditions of the ancestors would have made it almost impossible to exercise. A paterfamilias who contemplated such an act would have been expected to call a council of his entire extended family to sit in judgment first. To act alone would have brought unbearable shame and social ostracism upon him and his house. In this view, the Vitaneck Q-potest was not a tool to be used, but the ultimate symbol of the father's authority. There was a nuclear option, whose power came from the fact that it existed, not that it was ever deployed. Its purpose was to instill respect and maintain the rigid hierarchy of the family, which was seen as a microcosm of the state itself. This Roman obsession with hierarchy, with knowing who was on top and who was below, both within the family and in society at large, was all consuming. The power of the father kept the family in order, that as Rome grew wealthier and more powerful, new threats to the social order emerged. People from lower classes were getting rich. They started buying nice things, wearing fancy clothes, and acting like they were better than their station. And to the traditional Roman elite, that simply would not do. They needed a new kind of law, not to control crime, but to control consumption itself. You're rewatching Rome transform. The small, scrappy republic of farmers is growing fat and rich from its conquests. An enormous river of wealth, gold, silver, exotic goods, and slaves is flowing into the city from every corner of the Mediterranean. The old, austere values of the 12 tables are beginning to erode. You see it in the streets. A merchant whose grandfather was a simple potter is now wearing clothes dyed with expensive imported pigments. A general's wife hosts lavish dinner parties that last for days. The clear, rigid lines of the social hierarchy are getting blurry, and to the traditional Roman aristocracy, this is more dangerous than an invading army. The Roman elite believed that order depended on everyone knowing their place and acting like it. When a low-born man starts dressing like a senator, or a woman starts flaunting wealth that outshines the old families, it undermines the very foundation of their society. Their solution to this perceived crisis was not to redistribute wealth, but to regulate. They created a category of law that feels both petty and deeply intrusive, the leges sumptuariae, or sumpitiura laws. These were laws designed to control what people could buy, own, and, most importantly, display. One of the earliest and most famous of these was the Lex Oppiae, passed during the dark days of the Second Punic War when Hannibal was ravaging Italy. The law was a wartime austerity measure. It forbade any Roman woman from owning more than half an ounce of gold, from wearing a multi-colored garment specifically, one dyed with expensive purple, and from riding in an animal-drawn carriage within the city. It was a call for patriotic sacrifice. But what happened after the war was one, and the crisis was over, is what's truly revealing. Rome was now flooded with wealth. The women of Rome, feeling they had done their part, wanted the law repealed. They wanted to enjoy the fruits of victory. The historian Livy gives a vivid account of the debate. The women of Rome poured out of their homes and staged a massive public protest, blocking the streets leading to the Forum and lobbying every politician they could find. On the floor of the Senate, the arch-conservative Cato, the elder, gave a furious speech, arguing that repealing the law would unleash female luxury and extravagance, which would corrupt the men and destroy the state. He thundered, "If you allow them to start pulling off their restraints and setting them on an equal footing with their husbands, do you think they will be tolerable? The moment they begin to be your equals, they will be your superiors." Despite his protests, the law was repealed. The women won. But the idea of using law to police public displays of wealth had taken hold. This brings us to the ultimate status symbol in Rome, the one color that was so powerful, so prestigious, that it became the object of intense legal obsession: purple. But not just any purple. We're talking about Tyrian purple, a dye extracted in minuscule amounts from a specific species of sea snail. The process was incredibly labor-intensive, requiring tens of thousands of snails to produce enough dye for a single garment, and it created a stench so foul that dye miners' works were located outside city walls. The result was a brilliant, color fast purple that became synonymous with power and royalty. The law became obsessed with who was allowed to wear this color. Eventually, under the empire, the rules became rigid. Only the emperor himself could wear a solid purple toga. Senators were granted the privilege of wearing a toga with a purple striped lattice govos, the width of which was carefully prescribed by law. To wear the wrong kind of purple, or a stripe that was too wide for your station, was not a fashion faux pas. It was a usurpation of status, a political crime. The law was using color to create a visual, instantly recognizable map of the social and political hierarchy. You could tell a man's rank from 100 yards away just by looking at his clothes. But here's the odd little detail that reveals the almost magical thinking behind this. The Romans believed that certain objects and materials held intrinsic qualities. Purple wasn't just a color, it held a kind of power. This belief was so strong that it extended to some truly strange prohibitions. For instance, there were laws that banned certain high-ranking priests from even touching, or in some cases, even mentioning certain things that were considered common or unclean, like raw meat, dogs, or beans. The law was trying to maintain a kind of ritual purity for its elites, separating them not just visually, but spiritually, from the everyday world of common people. This entire concept of some PTU laws has sparked a long running academic debate. What was the real motivation behind them? The traditional interpretation, the one the Romans themselves gave, is the moral one. These laws were passed to combat the decline of virtue, to fight against the corrupting influence of luxury, and to restore the good old fashion, discipline and frugality that had made Rome great. They were a finger-wagging attempt to legislate morality. However, a more modern, economic interpretation suggests something else entirely. These laws weren't about morality. They were about protecting the established elites from competition. The old aristocratic families had their wealth tied up in land. The new money class of merchants and bankers could often outspend them on luxury goods. By legally banning the purchase and display of these goods, the old guard was essentially pulling up the ladder behind them. They were making it illegal for their new rivals to use wealth to acquire the one thing they truly craved: status. The laws weren't designed to make everyone frugal. They were designed to ensure that only the right people could look and act like the ruling class. So, was it a noble, if futile, battle for Rome's soul? Or was it a cynical act of economic protectionism disguised as a moral crusade? The Romans tried to use the law to freeze the social hierarchy in place, to make sure a man's toga told the true story of his rank. They were policing appearances, but there was another social crisis brewing, one that went beyond appearances and threatened the very future of the elite class itself. The great families of Rome were, to put it bluntly, not having enough babies, and the state was about to step in with a series of laws that would pry open the bedroom doors of the aristocracy. The Roman elite had successfully turned clothing into a legal document, a way to enforce the social order at a single glance. But as the Republic faded and the first emperor, Augustus, came to power, he faced a much more intimate and existential threat. The very families that made up the senatorial and equestrian classes, the traditional bedrock of Roman governance, were disappearing. For generations, they had been consolidating their vast estates by having fewer children to divide their inheritance among. Many men from the upper classes were also delaying marriage or staying bachelors altogether, preferring the freedom of a single life to the duties of raising a family. For Augustus, who is trying to restore stability and traditional values after decades of civil war, this was a demographic catastrophe. The ruling class was failing to reproduce itself. His solution was one of the most audacious and intrusive legal programs in history. If the elites wouldn't do their duty voluntarily, he would use the full force of the law to compel them. In 18 BC, Augustus passed a series of laws, collectively known as the Julian and Poppy and Minus Poppian laws. that amounted to a state-sponsored campaign of forced marriage and procreation, aimed squarely at the upper classes. Imagine you are a wealthy, unmarried Roman senator in your 30s. You're enjoying your life, attending lavish parties, and have no interest in settling down. Suddenly, under these new laws, your comfortable life is appended. Being a bachelor is no longer a lifestyle choice. It's a legal disability. The law now states that if you are unmarried by a certain age, you are legally barred from inheriting any property from anyone outside your immediate family. That rich uncle who was going to leave you his massive estate in his will, forget it. You're not eligible if you're married but have no children. The penalty is nearly as bad. You can only receive half of any inheritance left to you. The laws turned the entire system of wills and legacies into a tool for social engineering. Suddenly, marriage and children were no longer just a family matter. They were the key to your financial future. The only way to gain full inheritance rights and be considered a complete citizen in the eyes of the law was to be a married man with at least 3 children. The state was literally offering a cash minus for minus kids program, using the promise of future inheritances as the ultimate incentive. But it didn't stop there. The laws also created a series of political privileges for fathers. In the race for public office, a candidate with children was given preference over a childless one. For every child a magistrate had, he was allowed to hold office 1 year earlier than the legally prescribed age. The law was creating a daddy track to the top of the political ladder. Conversely, it imposed penalties on the childless. A senator without children could see his influence wane, as his colleagues with full legal standing moved past him. It was a comprehensive system designed to reward procreation and punish celibacy at every turn. And here is where you find a truly strange and revealing little quirk in the system, one that shows the bizarre loopholes people tried to use. The goal of the law was to produce legitimate heirs for the Roman elite, but the law was so focused on the number of children that it created a strange market. To get the legal benefits of having 3 children without the actual hassle of raising them, some childless couples would engage in a sham adoption. They would adopt a child to satisfy the legal requirement, only to immediately emancipate them. Setting them free, they would have legally been a father for a day, claimed the legal and financial privileges, and then discarded the child. The law had to be repeatedly updated to try and close these kinds of loopholes, a testament to the Roman elite's determination to avoid the very duties the state was trying to force upon them. This entire legal program raises a fundamental question, one that historians still debate fiercely. Did it actually work? Did Augustus's moral and demographic legislation succeed in getting the Roman aristocracy to have more children? The traditional view, for a long time, was that it was a colossal failure. Ancient writers like the historian Tacitus scoffed at the laws, claiming they were universally ignored, cleverly evaded, and ultimately did nothing to change the social habits of the elite. He painted a picture of a population that simply refused to be legislated into the bedroom, using every trick in the book to defy the emperor's will. However, a more recent wave of scholarship has challenged this view by meticulously examining inscriptions, census data, and legal records. Some historians now argue that the laws, while unpopular, were actually moderately successful. They suggest that the financial and political incentives were too powerful to ignore. The data seems to indicate a small but noticeable uptick in marriage rates and the number of children among the upper classes in the generations after the laws were passed. They argue that Tacitus, writing with a strong anti-imperial bias, was more interested in painting a picture of moral decay than in accurately reporting the facts. So, was this the ultimate example of failed government overreach, or was it as surprisingly effective, if coercive, peace or social policy? The jury of historians is still out. The Roman state's willingness to reach into the most private aspects of its citizens' lives, from their clothing to their family planning, was a hallmark of its desire for order. But far to the north, in the cold, misty lands of Scandinavia, a completely different society was developing a legal system based not on state control, but on personal honor, a concept so powerful it could be balanced on the edge of an axe. The orderly, centralized world of Rome, with its stone-paved roads and meticulous legal codes, dissolves into mist. You find yourself in a different landscape, one of dense, dark forests, rugged coastlines, and long, cold winters. The air smells of pine, salt water, and wood smoke. You are in the world of the Vikings, the Norsemen of early medieval Scandinavia. There is no single, all-powerful state here. No emperor dictating laws from a distant capital. Society is organized around clans, chieftains, and, most importantly, the individual free farmer. And their law is a reflection of this world that is personal, confrontational, and deeply obsessed with the concept of honor. But what about insults? In a society so fixated on personal reputation, a public insult could be more damaging than a physical wound. And this is where Norse law gets wonderfully and weirdly specific. They had a legal category for slanderous poetry, code, to compose a verse that accused another man of cowardice or, even worse, of being sexually passive. The ultimate insult to a Viking man's honor was a major crime. The law didn't just ban it. It had a tiered system. A simple insulting statement might carry a certain fine, but if you composed a full, formal poem of insult, an IV, so the penalty was much higher. If you went so far as to carve the insulting verses into a score-posed NIST, a pole topped with a horse's head that you then aimed at your enemy's farm, you could be declared a full outlaw, a man with no rights whom anyone could kill without penalty. The law treated symbolic, poetic attacks with the same gravity as physical ones, because in their world, a man's reputation was his most valuable possession. This obsession with honor and personal judgment led to their most famous and most misunderstood legal practice, the home gang, or trailblazer. What happened if there was a dispute over property, or an insult where there were no witnesses? In Rome, you might be sent to the river ordeal. In the Viking world, you could challenge your accuser to a duel. This wasn't a lowest brawl. The home gang was a highly ritualized legal procedure. The duel would take place on a small island or a specially marked -out cloak on the ground. There were specific rules for the types of weapons allowed, the number of shields each combatant could use, and how a man could yield to admit defeat. The idea wasn't simply that the strongest man would win. It was believed that the gods, particularly the god of justice, Tyr, would favor the man who was in the right. The duel was a way of asking for divine judgment when human evidence was lacking. The winner of the home gang didn't just win the fight. He won the legal case. The verdict was delivered by the edge of a sword. But this brings us to a major academic debate surrounding Norse law. How much of this picture is accurate, and how much is a romanticized fantasy shaped by the Icelandic sagas? The sagas are our main source for many of these stories of duels, poetic insults, and dramatic courtroom showdowns at the thing. They are epic tales of feuding families and larger than life heroes, written down centuries after the events they describe. The central question is, are the sagas reliable historical sources for how the legal system actually worked -to-day? One school of thought argues that they are essentially historical novels. They take the kernel of legal reality and embellish it for dramatic effect. The constant duels and heroic legal battles, in this view, were probably much rarer than the sagas make them seem. Most disputes were likely settled through boring negotiation and payment of fines, not bloody combat. The other view is that while the sagas are literature, they were written for an audience that knew the law intimately. The authors couldn't just make things up. The legal framework had to be authentic for the stories to be believable. Therefore, the sagas, used carefully, can give us a deep and rich understanding of the legal mindset of the Viking Age. Was it a world of constant, honor-fueled violence? Or was that just the exciting highlight reel preserved in their literature? The answer likely lies somewhere in the murky middle. The Viking world, with its decentralized, honor-based system, feels a world away from the bureaucratic empires we've seen. But as we move east, across the vast depths of Eurasia, we find another rising power, one that would combine the brutal efficiency of state control with a legal logic that made everyone responsible for their neighbors' actions. Your journey now takes you to ancient China and the unyielding laws of the first emperor. The bracing, salty air of the Norse fjords gives way to a different climate. You have traveled eastward, across vast continents, and now you stand in the heartland of ancient China. The landscape is one of lowest plains, winding rivers, and meticulously cultivated fields of millet and rice. For centuries, this land was fractured, divided among warring states, each with its own ruler, its own army, and its own customs. This was an age of chaos, but also of profound intellectual ferment, where 100 schools of thought blossomed, each offering a different vision for how to restore order to the world. And then one state, the state of Qin, conquered them all. In 221 BC, the king of Qin united China for the first time, declaring himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor. His goal was not just to rule a collection of defeated states, but to forge them into a single, unified, and ruthlessly efficient empire. To do this, he needed more than just a powerful army. He needed a powerful ideology, and he found it in a philosophy known as legalism. Legalism was the polar opposite of the other major schools of thought like Confucianism, which emphasized morality, virtue, and family relationships. Legalist thinkers were profoundly cynical about human nature. They believed that people were inherently selfish and lazy, and that the only way to make them behave was through a system of clear, strict laws and harsh, predictable punishments. They had no interest in debating what was good or moral. They were interested in what worked. For the legalists, the state was everything, and the law was simply a tool to strengthen and enrich the state. Under the guidance of his chief minister, the arch-minus legalist Li Si, the first emperor implemented a system of laws designed to break down old loyalties Andre-engine, Yasoj on the ground up. He standardized everything weights and measures, the currency, the axle widths of cars, so they would all fit the same ruts in the new imperial roads, and, most importantly, the writing system, and he applied the law to everyone, theoretically, from the lowest peasant to the highest noble, with cold, impersonal precision. If a government official failed to meet his quota, or was late in delivering taxes, the punishment was severe, often death. It was a system of management by terror. But the most ingenious and chillingly effective legal tool the Qin state used was the law of collective responsibility, or mutual surveillance. This was a system designed to turn every citizen into an agent of the state, a policeman watching over his own neighbors. The law organized all households into small groups of 5 or 10 families, and the rule was simple: if one person in your group committed a crime, all the other members of the group would suffer the same punishment. Let's stop and think about the psychological genius of this. Imagine you are a farmer in a small village. You know that your neighbor, Lao Wang, is secretly brewing untaxed alcohol or hiding a deserter from the army. In another society, you might turn a blind eye. It's not your business. You don't want to get involved. But under Qin law, his crime is now your crime. If he gets caught, you and your entire family could be sentenced to forced labor on the Great Wall, or even executed. Suddenly, you had a very powerful, personal incentive to be a whistleblower. The law didn't just punish crime. It proactively destroyed the social trust that might allow crime to fester. It turned communities against themselves, making it impossible for anyone to hide. Your loyalty was no longer to your neighbor, but to the state, because your own survival depended on it. This leads to a strange and specific legal point that highlights the system's ruthless logic. The law didn't just punish you for failing to report a crime, it also rewarded you for doing so. If you informed on your neighbor, you would often receive the same reward as an officer who beheaded an enemy in battle. Conversely, the law stated that to harbor a criminal was an even worse crime than what the criminal himself had done. The state was actively trying to break the bonds of community and family loyalty, seeing them as direct competitors to the absolute authority of the emperor. This system, of course, has been the subject of endless historical debate. What was the true legacy of Qin legalism? The traditional Chinese historical view, written largely by Confucian scholars who came after the Qin dynasty collapsed, paints it as an unmitigated disaster. They describe Qin Shi Huang as a paranoid tyrant and his laws as inhumanly cruel. They argue that the system was so oppressive, so brutal, that it was unsustainable. The people suffered so terribly under its weight that as soon as the first emperor died, the entire dynasty imploded in a massive popular rebellion. In this view, legalism was a failed experiment, a dark chapter that proved that ruling through fear alone will always fail. However, a more revisionist school of thought offers a different perspective. These historians argue that while the Qin dynasty itself was short-lived, its legalist innovations were profoundly influential and formed the blueprint for all subsequent Chinese dynasties. They argue that later dynasties, even those that publicly championed Confucian morality, secretly adopted the core legalist machinery of bureaucratic control, centralized power, and collective responsibility. They simply clothed the harsh legalist skeleton in a more palatable Confucian robe. In this interpretation, Qin wasn't a failure. It was the brutal but necessary foundation upon which 2,000 years of Chinese imperial rule were built. Was the Qin system a cruel anomaly, or was it the secret, unaccountably DNA of the Chinese state? It remains a core question in the study of Chinese history. The Qin sought to make everyone equal before the law, even if that equality was one of shared terror and responsibility. But across the Himalayas, in the subcontinent of India, a very different legal and social system was being codified. It was a system built not on the principle of equality, but on its absolute rejection. It was a world where who you were mattered far more than what you had done. You leave the rigidly controlled, grayscale world of Qin China behind. Your journey takes you southwest, over the formidable Himalayas, and down into the vibrant, colorful, and noisy subcontinent of India. The air here is thick with the scent of spices, incense, and monsoon rain. This is a land of ancient kingdoms, profound philosophies, and a social structure so complex and deeply rooted that it has shaped life here for millennia. Around the same time that the Romans were codifying their 12 tables and the legalists were unifying China, scholars in India were compiling one of the most influential and controversial legal texts in human history. It's known as the Manusmriti, or the Laws of Manu. Manu was a mythical figure, the archetypal first man in Hindu tradition, and these laws were presented as his divinely inspired wisdom, a blueprint for the ideal society. Unlike the law codes we've seen so far, the laws of Manu are not just about crime and punishment. They are a comprehensive guide to life itself. They contain rules on everything from how to greet a guest and what a king's daily duties are, to what you should eat and who you should marry. But at the absolute core of this entire legal and social universe is a single, powerful idea, the caste system, or Varna. The laws of Manu describe a society divided into 4 hierarchical social classes, which were said to have been born from the body of the cosmic man. Tirasha, at the very top are the Brahmins, the priests and scholars, who sprang from the head. They are the keepers of sacred knowledge and ritual. Below them are the Kshatriyas, the warriors and rulers, who came from the arms. They are responsible for protection and governance. Next are the Vyayas, the merchants and landowners, born from the thighs. They are the engine of the economy. And at the bottom are the Shudras, the laborers and servants, who came from the feet. Their duty is to serve the other 3 castes. Outside of this Brahmanas part system entirely are the untouchables, now known as Dalits. People who performed the most ritually impure jobs and were considered outside the social order altogether. In the world of the laws of Manu, justice is anything but blind. Your caste determines your rights, your duties, and your value in the eyes of the law. This is where the legal system takes on a logic that is profoundly alien to the idea of equality. A crime's punishment is not based on the crime itself, but on the relative caste of the perpetrator and the victim. Let's take the crime of slander. If a Brahmin insults a Kshatriya, the laws of Manu prescribe a relatively modest fine. However, if a low-minus caste Shudra dares to insult a Brahmin, the punishment is horrific. The text states that an iron nail, 10 fingers long, should be heated red minus hot and thrust into his mouth. The same logic applies to theft. If a Shudra steals from a Brahmin, the punishment is severe. If a Brahmin steals from a Shudra, the penalty is a minor slap on the wrist. It is a system of justice explicitly designed to maintain the purity and privilege of the higher castes and the subjugation of the lower ones. Your birth determines your legal worth. This system is filled with bizarre and incredibly detailed rules designed to prevent the mixing of castes, which was seen as a source of cosmic chaos. For example, the laws around food are incredibly intricate. A Brahmin is forbidden from eating any food that has been prepared by a Shudra, unless that food has been fried in ghee, because the purifying nature of the sacred butter was believed to neutralize the ritual pollution. The laws governing marriage are even stricter, creating a complex hierarchy of what unions were permissible and which were considered abominations that would produce children of mixed caste, who would then fall into their own complicated sub-minus categories of social standing. This leads us to one of the most significant and sensitive debates in South Asian history. What is the relationship between this ancient legal text, the Manu Smriti, and the reality of the caste system as it has been practiced for centuries? For a long time, colonial and some early Indian scholars viewed the laws of Manu as a literal code, the foundational document that single-handedly created and enforced the caste system across India. They saw it as the definitive rulebook for Hindu society. However, a growing number of modern historians argue that this gives the text far too much credit. They contend that the Manu Smriti was not a state-enforced legal code that a king's judge would consult to hand down sentences. Instead, it was a Dharmasastra, a theoretical and ideological text written by a specific school of Brahmin scholars. It represented their vision of a perfect, divinely ordered society. It was a Brahmin's utopian dream of how the world should be, not necessarily a description of how it was. In this view, the reality of caste on the ground was always far more fluid, complex, and contested than the rigid system described in the text. Local customs, the power of regional kings, and economic realities often mattered more than the pronouncements of a sacred book. The laws of Manu, they argue, was less a law and more a piece of powerful social propaganda. It became influential not because kings enforced it, but because its ideas were so powerful that they seeped into the cultural and religious fabric of the subcontinent over many centuries. Was it the cause of the caste system, or was it a symptom and a justification of a social structure that was already developing? This question remains at the heart of understanding Indian social history. The intricate, divinely ordered hierarchy of ancient India was one way of structuring the world. But as we take our final steps on this journey, we move to the misty, green fringes of Europe, to a world governed not by written codes or sacred texts, but by the mysterious pronouncements of priestly judges who left no records at all. The world of the Celts and their druid lawgivers. The air grows cool and damp. You've journeyed to the furthest edge of the ancient world, as the Romans knew it, to the misty, green islands and peninsulas of Western Europe. You leave behind the world of stone tablets, tapir's scrolls, and sacred texts. Here, among the Celtic tribes of Gaul, Britain, and Ireland, the law is not something you read. It is something you hear. It lives not on the page, but in the memory of a unique and powerful class of people, the Druids. You find yourself in a clearing deep within an ancient oak forest. The trees are huge, their branches heavy with moss, forming a living cathedral that blots out the sky. There is no courthouse here, no grand basilica. The community gathers in a circle, their faces lit by the flickering light of a central fire. And at the center of it all is the Druid. He is not a king, but the king listens to him. He is not a warrior, but warriors fear his judgment. He is a judge, a priest, a philosopher, a scientist, and a teacher, all rolled into one. He is the intellectual hard drive of his entire society. The Celtic peoples, and especially the Druids, had a profound and deliberate distrust of the written word for their most important knowledge. The Roman general Julius Caesar, who fought them for years and observed their customs with a mix of fascination and contempt, noted this with surprise. He said the Druids believed that committing their sacred knowledge, their laws, their histories, their genealogies to writing would weaken the mind. True learning came from memorization. A druid in training might spend up to 20 years learning this craft, committing tens of thousands of verses of law and lore to memory. The law was a form of poetry, a rhythmic chant passed down through generations. This made the druids the ultimate gatekeepers of justice. A legal dispute wasn't settled by consulting a book, but by appealing to the druid, who would recite the ancient precedents that applied to the case. His authority rested on his colossal memory. It was a truly terrifying final exam, because their legal system was oral. It was also incredibly flexible. A druid could interpret the poetic laws to fit new situations, and his judgment was considered divinely inspired and final. If a man refused to abide by a druid's decision, the punishment was not imprisonment or death, but something arguably worse in their society. He would be excommunicated. He would be barred from attending sacrifices, which was like being cast out from the favor of the gods. No one would speak to him, no one would trade with him, and no one would offer him justice if he was wrong. He became an ominous person, a ghost in his own community. But within this oral legal tradition, there existed a concept that is uniquely Celtic, a kind of personalized, magical law that is utterly bizarre. This was the J's pronounced G's. A G's was a sacred taboo, a prohibition, or sometimes a destiny laid upon a specific individual, often a hero or a king. It was the general law for everyone, but a personal rule just for you. A G's could be a source of a hero's power, but breaking it, intentionally or not, would lead to your inevitable ruin and death. The Irish myths are full of them. The great hero, C.U. Tulane, for instance, had a G's forbidding him from eating the meat of a dog his own name meant, Hound of Colan. He also had another G's that forbade him from ever refusing a woman's hospitality. In the story of his final battle, his enemies conspire to have an old hag offer him a meal of roasted dog meat. He is trapped. If he refuses the meal, he breaks his G's of hospitality. If he eats it, he breaks his G's about eating his namesake animal. He chooses to eat. His power is broken, and he dies in the battle that follows. The G's operated like a strand of fate, a personalized, inescapable divine law woven into a person's very being. This brings us to the great, unresolved mystery of the Druids. Almost everything we know about the continental Druids comes from their enemies, the Romans, and primarily from Julius Caesar. So, the academic world is locked in a debate how much of the Roman account can we actually believe. One perspective is to take the Roman sources, particularly Caesar, largely at face value. Caesar was a brilliant and perceptive general. He describes the Druids as a powerful, highly organized, and sophisticated international priesthood, with a central headquarters in Gaul where they would meet to settle major disputes. He also attributes to them grim practices, most notably large minor-scale human sacrifice, where victims were allegedly burned alive in giant wicker men. In this view, the Druids were the powerful, and perhaps sinister, leaders of a complex society, and their elimination by the Romans was a major turning point in European history. The other perspective is that the Roman accounts are little more than calculated propaganda. This school of thought argues that Caesar had a vested interest in portraying the Druids as a barbaric and dangerous threat, by emphasizing their political power and supposed practice of human sacrifice. He could justify his brutal and costly conquest of Gaul to the Senate back in Rome. He was painting them as the leaders of a dangerous foreign religion that needed to be stamped out for the good of civilization. In this view, the Druids might have been a much less organized and more diverse group of local holy men, and the more lurid stories might be pure invention. Because the Druids themselves refused to write anything down, they left no rebuttal. They were silenced, and their true nature is lost in the mists of time, leaving us to forever wonder who they really were. And with that, our journey through the strange legal landscapes of the ancient world is drawing to a close. From the sun-baked fields of Mesopotamia to the misty groves of the Celts, we've seen societies grapple with the same fundamental problems, but invent wildly different and often bizarre solutions. We've seen that what looks silly on the surface often hides a deep, practical logic. But if we take one final step back and look at the entire tapestry we've woven, a single, unifying thread begins to emerge, connecting them all. The fire in the Druid's grove dims, the mists close in, and you feel yourself pulling back, floating up and away from the ancient world. You see the whole vast panorama of your journey laid out beneath you, the green Isle of the Celts, the rigid grade of a Roman camp, the sun-bleached Hagar of Athens, the gleaming pyramids by the Nile, the dusty ziggurats of Babylon. They are all so different, their beliefs so varied, their customs so unique, and yet, as you look down upon this great map of human history, a common pattern begins to resolve itself out of the noise. A single, powerful current runs beneath almost every strange law we have encountered. It's the protection of property. When you get right down to it, when you strip away the divine justifications, the high-minded philosophy, and the bizarre rituals, you find that most of these silly laws are, at their core, sophisticated mechanisms for defining and defending what a society considers valuable. The definition of property just changes from place to place. Let's go back to the very beginning, that Mesopotamian ox. The law forbidding you from annoying it wasn't about animal welfare. The ox was property in its purest, most vital form. It was a family's entire economic engine. The law was protecting capital. Look at the Egyptian cat. Yes, it was the incarnation of the goddess Bastet, and the religious belief was sincere. But why the animal? Because it protected the grain stores, the foundational wealth of the entire Egyptian state, from vermin. The law deified the nation's most effective asset minus protection specialist. It was a spiritual fence built around the national treasury. This same logic extends to things that aren't so tangible. Think of the Romans, some PT laws that obsessed over the color purple. What was that about? It was about protecting the property of status. In a hierarchical society, your rank, your public standing, was your most important intangible asset. It gave you access to power, opportunities, and respect. When a wealthy merchant of low births started wearing the same purple-striped toga as a senator, he wasn't just wearing a nice outfit. He was infringing on the senator's property, diluting the value of his status. The law wasn't policing fashion. It was policing the theft of prestige. Even the deeply personal laws, like Augustus's attempts to force the Roman elite to marry and have children, can be seen through this lens. The property he was trying to protect was the ruling class itself. He saw the great families as a collective asset of the state, and their failure to reproduce was a form of asset depreciation. The inheritance laws were a legal tool designed to ensure the continuity and stable transfer of the ultimate form of property, the Roman elite's control over Rome itself. And what about the Vikings, in their misty northern world? What was their obsession with honor and their elaborate fines for insults? In a decentralized society with no strong state to guarantee contracts or enforce judgments, a man's reputation was his property. His honor was his credit rating, his business card, and his security deposit, all rolled into one. A good reputation meant people would trade with you, sail with you, and fight alongside you. A slanderous poem that damaged that reputation was a direct attack on your ability to function and prosper. The law that put a price tag on an insult was simply recognizing that a man's good name was his most valuable and most vulnerable piece of property. This brings us to a wonderfully odd concept that underpins many of these systems, the legal fiction. To make these laws work, societies had to agree to believe in things that weren't literally true. They had to agree that an ox wasn't just an animal, it was a plow. They had to agree that a cat wasn't just a cat, it was a god. They had to agree that a Roman son, even a 40-year-old general, wasn't a man, but his father's property. This ability to create a fictio legis, a shared legal make-believe, was a powerful tool that allowed them to extend the protection of law to concepts like status and reputation. And this reveals a fundamental debate that still shapes how we understand legal history. Is law primarily a tool for creating a just and orderly society? Or is it primarily a tool for protecting the property of those powerful enough to write the laws? One view, often called legal formalism, looks at these ancient codes as noble attempts to create rational systems of justice. They see the protection of property as a necessary foundation for a stable society for everyone. But another view, legal realism, is more cynical. It argues that law is almost always an expression of power. The reason property is so fiercely protected in all these codes is because the people writing them, the priests, the aristocrats, the wealthy landowners, were the ones who had the most property to protect. The laws weren't creating order for everyone. They were creating a legal fortress to defend the assets of the ruling class. The silly law that protects the rich man's ox might seem pragmatic, but what about the law that executes a starving man for stealing a cabbage? Both are about property, but they don't serve the same interests. So, beneath all the fascinating variety, the single, unblinking focus on property, in all its forms, is the unifying feature. It's the engine that drives the legal innovation, and by creating these strict, often brutal, definitions of what belongs to whom, these ancient laws were doing more than just protecting assets. They were building the very framework of their societies, creating the hierarchies, the rules, and the roles that kept their worlds from spinning into chaos. As you continue to float above this panorama of ancient worlds, you start to see that protecting property was only half the story. It was the what, but it wasn't the why. Why this relentless focus on rules, on defining boundaries, on assigning value to everything from a beast of burden to a man's reputation? The answer is woven into the very fabric of civilization itself. All these laws, from the most pragmatic to the most profoundly weird, were fundamentally about one thing: managing fear. The natural state of humanity isn't order. It's chaos. It's the uncertainty of a bad harvest, the terror of a sudden raid, the social friction of living in close quarters with thousands of other selfish, ambitious, and unpredictable people. The law, in its essence, is a grand and elaborate attempt to build a wall against that chaos. It's a system designed to make the world predictable. Think about the rigid social hierarchy of the laws of Manu in India. From a modern perspective that values equality, it seems monstrously unjust. But from the perspective of its Brahmin authors, it was the ultimate tool for creating social stability. By assigning every single person a specific role, a specific duty dharma, and a specific place in the cosmic order, the system aimed to eliminate social competition and ambition. If you are a Shudra, your role is to say, you don't waste your time dreaming of becoming a warrior or a priest. You know your path from the moment you are born. This rigid structure, as unjust as it was designed to create a perfectly predictable society, a world free from the chaos of social striding, a world where everyone knew their place and, theoretically, there was no conflict. Or consider the Qin dynasty's brutal system of collective responsibility in China. It was horrific, turning neighbors into spies and destroying community trust. But the fear it was managing was the fear of rebellion, the fear of dissent that could unravel the newly unified empire. By making everyone responsible for everyone else, the law created a powerful, self-regulating network of control. It made the cost of disobedience so high and so certain that, in theory, no one would dare step out of line. It created order not through virtue or loyalty, but through a perfectly calculated and perfectly predictable application of terror. Even the more positive laws were about this same impulse for predictability. The Roman law about your neighbor's overhanging tree branches wasn't just about protecting your sunlight. It was about preventing 1,000 potential, unpredictable conflicts. Before the law, your only options were to argue, to fight, or to let your resentment simmer. The outcome was uncertain. The law replaced that uncertainty with a clear, predictable procedure. You know your rights. He knows his obligations. The potential for chaos is neutralized and replaced with a simple, boring rule. This is the quiet, unsung genius of so much of law. It makes life boringly predictable, and in doing so, it makes it safe. And here we stumble upon a wonderfully strange and obscure legal concept from ancient Ireland that perfectly illustrates this idea of creating order from chaos. The Brehon laws of Ireland had a specific term for what you might call socially awkward or disruptive animals. They had rules for a digging dog, a cat that is a known thief of milk, and, most poetically, for a hen that wanders into another's garden. But the most fascinating was the rule for the jester's bee. A jester or a poet might keep bees, and if one of these bees stung someone, the law had to figure out who was liable. The law determined that if the bee was away from its hive and stung someone, the owner was not liable, because the bee was on its own excursion, essentially acting as an agent of chaos outside its owner's control. The law was trying to draw a line, to define the exact point where predictable ownership ended and random misfortune began. It was a heroic, a slightly absurd, attempt to impose legal order on the chaotic flight of a single bee. This constant effort to legislate predictability leads to a deep philosophical debate among legal historians. Does law create social order, or does it merely reflect it? The traditional view is that law is a civilizing force imposed from the top down. A great lawgiver like Hammurabi or Solon comes along and gives the people a code, which then shapes their behavior and creates a stable society. The law is the active ingredient. But a powerful counterminer's argument suggests that formal, written law is often just catching up to the powerful, unwritten customs and social norms that already govern a society. In this view, the law doesn't create order. It just codifies the order that already exists. For example, the Romans probably had customary ways of dealing with tree branches long before it was written in the 12 tables. The written law simply gave the existing norm the stamp of state authority. This view argues that real social order comes not from the threat of punishment, but from the shared values and customs that make people want to live together peacefully in the first place. So is law the engine of social order, or is it just the caboose? Whichever view you take, the goal is the same. These ancient societies were all engaged in a monumental construction project. They were building invisible structures of rules and prohibitions to contain the terrifying randomness of life. By making the world predictable, they made it feel safer. They created a framework within which people could plan their lives, raise their families, and build their cities. But all structures, no matter how strong, eventually change, and the final chapter of our story is about how these ancient, specific, and often strange legal worlds slowly began to dissolve, paving the way for the world you live in now. You've stood in so many different worlds now, guided by so many different rules. You've learned the precise value of a Babylonian ox, the social cost of a Roman woman's jewelry, and the legal weight of a Viking's poem. All of these laws were intensely specific, rooted in the tangible realities of their time. They were laws you could almost touch a piece of pottery, a strip of purple cloth, the sharpened edge of a dueling axe. But the world you live in now is not governed by such things. You are governed by abstractions, due process, negligence, freedom of speech, reasonable doubt. So how did we get from there to here? How did the law shed its solid, physical body and become the ghost of principle that haunts our modern world? The story of that transformation is one of collapse and rediscovery, as the Western Roman Empire, that great engine of centralized law, slowly crumbled in the 5th century CE. Its sophisticated legal machinery broke down with it. The world became local again. In much of Europe, the written codes were forgotten. Justice reverted the old ways to local customs, to the pronouncements of a chieftain, to the blood feud settled between families. The nuanced arguments of a Roman jurist were replaced by the simple, brutal logic of trial by ordeal. For centuries, if a case was impossible to solve, if there were no witnesses and no confession, you would turn to God for the verdict. The accused would be forced to carry a red-hot bar of iron, or be thrown into a body of water that had been blessed by a priest. If your hand healed cleanly, or if the holy water accepted you and you sank, you were innocent. If your hand festered, or if you floated, you were guilty. This wasn't just primitive superstition. It was what a legal system does when it has no other tools for finding the truth. It was a ritual for producing a final, definitive answer, backed by divine authority. But then, in the year 1215, something remarkable happened that would change everything. At a great meeting of church leaders known as the Fourth Lateran Council, the Pope issued a decree forbidding priests from participating in trials by ordeal. This is our final, strange little piece of law, and perhaps the most consequential. It seems minor that it pulled the entire legal foundation out from under medieval Europe. Without a priest to bless the iron or the water, the ordeal was no longer a sacred trial. It was just torture. It lost its legitimacy. This created a crisis in courtrooms everywhere. A judge could no longer turn to God for the answer. So what was he to do? He had to find a new way to determine guilt or innocence. And so, out of sheer necessity, they began to invent the building blocks of modern justice. They started relying more on witness testimony. They began to develop the idea of evidence. They started empaneling juries of local men, not to pass divine judgment, but to act as fact-finders who could determine what probably happened. The slow, painstaking process of rational inquiry began to replace the swift, dramatic certainty of divine judgment. At the very same time, another revolution was happening in monasteries and newly forming universities, particularly in Bologna, Italy. Scholars were unearthing forgotten texts. They found copies of a massive 6th-century compilation of Roman law ordered by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, the Corpus Juris Civilis. For these medieval thinkers, it was like discovering the blueprints for a lost technology. It was a complete, sophisticated system of legal thought, full of abstract principles for contracts, for property, for negligence, for all the complex interactions of a commercial society. This brings us to our final academic debate. After Rome fell, did its legal ideas vanish completely, only to be miraculously rediscovered in the 12th century, sparking a legal renaissance? This is the rupture theory. Or did a simplified, watered-down version of Roman law, what some call vulgar law, survive all along in local customs and church canons, keeping the flame alive until it could be rekindled? This is the continuity theory. Historians still argue about how clean the break really was, about how much was truly lost and how much just went dormant. Regardless of how it happened, the result was a fusion. The new, practical needs of the courts to find facts were combined with the old, sophisticated vocabulary of Roman law. And, in that fusion, the modern legal world was born. The specific, concrete rules of the ancient world began to dissolve. The law about your neighbor's ox, after being filtered through this new system, emerged as the abstract principle of negligence and liability for damages. The brutal Cain law of collective responsibility softened into the idea of a citizen's duty to the state. The Vikings' duel for honor was transformed into a court's formal judgment on a person's reputation. The ancient laws didn't so much die as they sublimated, turning from solid to gas, becoming the invisible atmosphere of principles that you breathe today. The rules are different, but the ghosts of the old laws are all around us. And so, the story gently comes to a close. The sharp edges of these ancient laws begin to soften and blur in your mind. The stern face of Hammurabi, the glint in a druid's eye, the flash of a Roman senator's purple toga. All of it begins to fade, like ink washing away on old papiers. You can feel them dissolving back into the past, becoming what they have always been, just whispers and echoes in a long, quiet hull. The clamor of the Athenian agora quiets down. The rhythmic chanting of the law-minus poems grows faint. The relentless sun over the Egyptian desert finally sets, giving way to the cool, deep silence of the night. There are no more cases to judge, no more rules to learn. The journey is over, and now, the only rhythm that matters is the soft, steady cadence of your own breathing, a quiet and ancient beat that pulls you deeper and deeper into rest. You are drifting now, on a slow, dark river of time, leaving the waking world and its noisy demands far, far behind on a distant shore. There is only stillness now, only quiet, and the gentle pool of awaiting dreams.